Waste of life mother executed by angry mob after doing unspeakable acts to her child. This is a story passed down through the generations from my family, so while the title may seem rather extreme, this all happened a very, very long time ago. I was debating if this would fit here or somewhere else, though it should be fine here. It goes without saying, this did not happen to me, but rather my great-great-grandfather back when he was a child living in a semi-small town in Louisiana. Please keep in mind that the people in the town were very much so racist, given the time and area, though they hated the mother far, far more than her child. The main characters in this story are as follows: great-great-grandfather, GGF, GGF's father, GGGF, demon mother, DM, Adam, the victim, DM's other son DM's, sheriff. Be warned, I am not going to spare any of the graphic details. I will be telling the story exactly as I have heard it. Keep in mind, this is all word of mouth. I personally have not been able to confirm this story, but my family insists that this has happened. Our story takes place in the 1880s in a very small town in eastern Louisiana. GGF and his family had moved from their native country of Spain to the Americas to flee inter-family conflict and had decided to settle with some other relatives. Within this small town there was just a few families that had established themselves there, one of which having been DM and her 2 children. DM had, at one point in her life, been a member of an extremely pronominal family in New Orleans, the woman actually being related to another famous murderer from the city, though distantly. From what GFF's family had been told, DM was a smart, though arrogant woman that had possessed an immeasurable amount of wealth, though lost it after her family disowned her for conceiving a child through adultery in her marriage. She had been married to a prominent doctor in the city, of which they had had one child, DMS, though when another child had been born, the husband had immediately called out adultery. DM's youngest son, Adam, had been born with caramel-colored skin and brown eyes, whereas both of his parents had eggshell white skin and blue eyes. After intense questioning, DM had confessed to having an affair with a local farmer, a man that had once been a slave but freed after the Civil War. Her family immediately disowned her, her fortune stripped, and DM was about to be tossed out on the streets, but her mother had given her just enough money behind the family's back to allow DM to survive far away from the city, dead to the rest of her family except her uncle, the sheriff, and her mother. DM had taken her sons with her, and from GGF's first look it was extremely clear how horrible Adam had been treated. Adam and GGF had gone to the same school, a small schoolhouse that also functioned as the church, with DM's, and on day 1 GGF noticed DM's repeatedly smacking Adam on the back of the head, punching him in the gut, and tripping him in the mud while away from the teacher's eyes. When GGF asked Adam about the hurting, he had simply gotten the answer, because I'm an NR. GGF, being an immigrant and not knowing the customs of the town, had shrugged it off and returned to playing. Months passed and the hurting continued. Adam would show up to school with black eyes, swollen lips, bruises, and no one would do anything about it, as the entire matter was considered a family matter, though even if someone had taken the initiative to confront DM about the hurting, she would meet them with the typical excuses of he gotten them while roughhousing, or he fell. One day though, things changed so much that GGF and his family had gotten involved. Though GGF and Adam weren't good free, they were the only 2 boys of age 6 at the time, so it was often that they would up playing after school or during lunch. DM's did not like this one bit. DM's had come up to the 2 boys one day, and this is roughly the conversation that had taken place. DM's: well, I didn't know we had an or lover here. What's your name, or lover? GGF: I don't know what that means, but I'm GGF. You must be Adam's older brother, right? Adam: DM's: leave us alone, we are trying to eat lunch. DM's had apparently thought it was a good idea to toss both boys' food on the ground at this point, deciding that he had a new plaything to bully. DM's: NRS and N are lovers like you. You two don't deserve to eat on tables. Go eat your food out of the dirt. It's important to note that DM's was around 12 at the time, double the age of the boys, so fighting back wasn't an option, and even if it was, it would give Adam hell at home. While GGF started to cry over his food, Adam had already gotten on the floor, attempting to pick up his sandwich before DM stomped on it, but rather than stomp on the sandwich, DM's had decided that it would be far more brutal to punch Adam in the back of the head while he was on his knees. After punching Adam, DM's punched GGF in the stomach before wandering off. Apparently the fact that DM's punched GGF in the gut was enough to piss off GGGF, as the next day GGGF paid DM a visit to sort things out. When GGGF met DM at her house, this was actually the first time they had seen each other, as DM was essentially an introvert at this point. GGGF was met with a tattered, withered mess of a woman. DM had only been around 27 or 28 at this time, but it was extremely easy to pass her off for being in her late 30s. Her hair was a ragged blonde mess, knotted and matted as one would expect. Her face wore a permanent, withered scowl of someone who had fallen from their absolute apex, doomed to fade out of their own existence like a withering zaza. Her once elegant gown had become nothing more than a tattered mess used to cover her obese form. DM had never gave GGGF any respect even from the beginning, the argument ensuing before the first word could be spoken. DM: why did you make me get off my chair? Do you understand I don't want guests, or are you just stupid? GGGF trying to keep his composition: I'm sorry ma'am, but it seems that our boys got into a little scuffle. Your boy, DM's, had punched my son and destroyed his lunch. Do you mind having a word with him? DM: I won't be scolding my son for beating up trash like your brat, just go F off. With that, DM had slammed the door. GGGF: feeling that it wasn't worth the effort to keep bothering the stubborn bitch, had decided that the best course of action was simply to teach his son how to fight. GGGF had taught GGF some dirty tricks to disarm DMs, though GGF had never had to use them. The next day something odd happened. Adam was nowhere to be seen. And then the next. And then the next. When the teacher had asked DMs where Adam was, DMs had said that he was very sick, though when she had asked what his symptoms were, DMs kept contradicting himself. One more day passed before it happened. One of the stray dogs in the neighborhood had ate up with something peculiar in his greedy maw, and after one of the townsfolk pried it from the dog's maw, it was clear that it was a human rib, one small enough to be a child's. Dots were connected immediately, though due to the sheriff being the DM's uncle, the sheriff had decided that he would check on things himself. After a few hours, the sheriff reported to the townsfolk that Adam had just been buried the day prior after dying of some unknown disease, the dog having dug up the child's rib somehow. No one bought it, though no one spoke in fear of any recoil an acquisition might have. GGGF, however, decided that he was going to take things into his own hands. He and 3 other men in the town had broken into the DM's house that night while her and her son were at the sheriff's office to discuss why she did not report the death right away, and what they found was absolutely terrifying. Warning: if you are easily grossed out, skip ahead. What they found was in fact Adam, though it was Adam in several pieces. In the basement of the house was where he was ended, the boy having been bisected at the waist, flayed, and dismembered beyond the point of recognition, minus his caramel skin, which had been sitting on a table in piles. His ribs had been plucked from his body, his organs nowhere to be found except a clump of entrails scattered across the room. His body had been absolutely defiled, and the assumption of his death was far from pleasant. 2 of the men stormed back to the town to spread the news as GGGF returned to his family to tell his son that he would never see Adam again. Justice was swift and brutal. Just about every person in town stormed the sheriff's office, and just about every person demanded justice. The sheriff insisted that his niece be given a fair trial, while DM had broken down crying. 100 eyes sing unrelenting anger into her very soul as they outraged over the merciless crime she committed. In the middle of the chaos, DM spoke up in a foolish attempt to protect his mother, saying that the only way that they would get their lives back was if the kid was dead and that he ruined their lives. This foolish plea fell on deaf ears, only managing to fuel the rage of the mob as they stormed the room and grabbed all 3 of those inside. DMs, and the sheriff were given no mercy, the crowd grabbing all 3 and beating all 3 mercilessly, DMs losing his life somewhere in the chaos. The remaining 2 were dragged to the top of the largest building and thrown off, though given it was only 2 floors, the crowd had continued to beat, and eventually stabbed the 2 until the life left them. And that was it. The 3 were buried in unmarked graves somewhere in the woods, while Adam's remains were buried in the local cemetery. In all, 4 lives were destroyed over the greed of 2 people, both trying to recapture the life they once knew through the most extreme method possible, while one man who could have avoided his death protected his family in a futile last resort. Tifu drifter. Many years ago, while recovering from a brutal marriage, I was a struggling single parent putting myself through grad school on a small teaching associate stipend. I was able to rent a modest apartment within walking distance of the urban campus. It was part of a series of small 100-year-old brick townhouses, which I imagine were very nice in their day. Over the years, as old buildings do, it had settled, and the doors and windows were askew enough to be drafty. In the snowy winter, we applied plenty of shrink-wrap window cling. In the summer, the brick building was like an oven, with no central AC, and ventilation was necessary to stave off heat stroke. Despite the hardships, we were safe, and we were content. After a couple of years, though, this changed when a new dude moved into a nearby apartment. Because of the scores of parking spaces behind the apartment block, he was assigned the parking space right behind mine. The guy was, apparently, an avid fan of the Fast and Furious franchise, having made various mods to his car and a vanity plate reading drifter. He spent all of his free time working on this stupid car, but the idiot had clearly neglected the car's actual engine and exhaust system, because in order to drive the thing, he had to warm it up for 10 to 15 minutes before driving off. Every single time. And it wasn't regular car exhaust, it was billowing and extra rich and smelled like the gasoline wasn't fully burning off. As I mentioned in the beginning, the apartment was old and drafty, so every time he decided to drive his car, sometimes several times a day, he would first let it billow clouds of noxious exhaust fumes into nearby apartments, and right into my 4-year-old's bedroom. I tried everything to keep the fumes out, but to no avail. My child and I both felt ill, every time. This was hurting my kid. I couldn't afford to move, and I was out of ideas. Seeing that he was outside working on his car again, but without giving too many details about myself, I approached the guy and explained that the fumes were filling my apartment and making me ill, and politely asked if he would mind warming up his car farther away from the surrounding apartments. He sneered at me and said, "Well, I'm sorry, but not all of us are lucky enough to have mommy and daddy pay for their car and put them through college. I'm sorry that my car is not up to your standards, but I'm not moving it." Shocked, I walked off in a different direction than my apartment, so he wouldn't know exactly where I lived. By the time I got home, I was angry, fuming. I knew some sort of formal complaint would likely go nowhere. Besides, it would be truly stupid to be the only person to do so right before whatever I was going to do next. I took some time to monitor his comings and goings and planned some proper consequences to fix the problem myself. The goal: to end the daily poisoning of my apartment and danger to my child, permanently. Budget: shoestring, of course, because I didn't have mommy and daddy to pay for my revenge budget. Skill level: low. The problem was the engine, and I had very little knowledge about how to quickly, quietly, and permanently disable an engine. I didn't know how to jimmy a lock, or open a locked gas cap, so I wouldn't be able to get access to the engine or gas tank. And no, I was not about to Google instructions. Time available, minutes at most. The parking lot was a very busy place. Students came and went at all hours of the day and night, and sometimes just hung out there to party or set nearby dumpsters on fire. As much as I wanted to, I couldn't just douse the car in gasoline or set it on fire, because it was parked way too close to my apartment. Cosmetic damage wouldn't work. Slashing tires or breaking windows, while satisfying, could be too loud, and not permanent. And then on reconnaissance day 2, I noticed it. His car was old enough to have little triangle windows for venting in the back windows, and he kept them open at night. The answer: I would fight fumes with fumes. The next day, I bought a cheap Gatorade squeeze bottle and some eggs. I made a yellow soup out of egg yolks and warm water to fill up the bottle about 2/3 full, then added some of the fresh dog poop that was always available next to the sidewalk outside. I screwed the cap onto the bottle and left it in the sun outside for several days, swirling it around from time to time. I waited for the early hours of a Tuesday morning, when the parking lot was the least busy, and snuck up to the car. The triangle windows were open. I popped the cap up, aimed it into the car, and sprayed days-old sun-baked rotten egg and dog poop soup over every available surface of the inside of his car, down the window wells, into the air conditioner vents, and soaking into crevices and upholstery. I tossed the Gatorade bottle of horror into the dumpster, went back inside, and went to sleep. The next day was a warm one. It was one of the great joys of my life to have been home that afternoon at just the right time to be startled by a man's voice screaming, "What the F? What the F?" I ran upstairs to the window he regularly fumigated, and through the blinds, watched the scene unfold. The dude had opened the driver's side door, and repeatedly moved his head closer to sniff and then gag, like he refused to believe the smell was coming from his car. He opened the other door to investigate. He kept yelling, "What the F?" And then he ran off. He came back a few minutes later wearing dishwashing gloves and carrying a stucco bucket full of sudsy water, a sponge, and a scrub brush. He spent the next half hour growling, holding his breath, bobbing his head into the car and scrubbing, pulling his head out to gag and scream "What the F?" and taking deep breaths to go back in. The scrubbing and retching and screaming were increasingly interspersed with pounding on the dashboard and the roof, kicking his rims, and loudly vowing revenge at the sky. Within about 30 minutes, he was surrounded by about 10 other dudes standing in a wide half circle around the car, some drinking beers, watching the show, laughing, and offering pointers, like King of the Hill came to life. It took him roughly an hour to realize that the battle had been lost. The dude's yelling became hoarse and whimpery. He retrieved his toolbox, removed a wrench, and started doing something new to the interior. He suddenly pulled out the entire driver's seat, walked away with it, and angrily heaved it into the dumpster. He did the same with the passenger seat. Then he took the bucket over and dumped the soapy poo soup water next to the dumpster, brought the bucket back to the car, turned it upside down, placed it where the driver's seat used to be, sat on it, and, I shit you not, drove off that way. I never saw the car again. He never drove it back. That, and his pride, must have been a total loss. My greatest regret is that because smartphones didn't exist, I have no recording of that glorious day. Don't want to pay me what I'm worth? Let's see how that works out for you. First time posting, but I have read a lot of these. So years ago, I was working for a laboratory that did a lot of testing for the military. It was a terrible job for a number of reasons. Despite having enormous responsibility, they never gave me credit for anything. In meetings with the department head, DH, they frequently blamed me for problems that they had caused, but I had solved them and they could not. They also hired consultants to come in and tell me I was wrong only to have the consultants say I was right, and the consultants would get paid 1/4 of my yearly salary for one day's worth of work. I only stayed as long as I did because it was my first real job and I honestly didn't know better. But before I left, by their own standards, I was severely underpaid. HR agreed. They claimed there was nothing that could be done. Meanwhile, other people were given off-schedule raises. Well, I wasn't the only one that was underpaid. There were a number of others as well, but none of them were critical to the operation of the laboratory. Eventually, the DH went to the director with a list of all the underpaid people. I found out that my name was on the top of the list as the most underpaid person. Not surprising. Using this list, the DH got permission from the director for one-time raises. An announcement was made. Well, guess who didn't get a raise? This despite the fact that I had made massive improvements in some of their processes that easily saved them millions per year, and their budget was just over $10 million. I was livid. I had enough and decided to leave. They hired 2 people to replace me at more than double my salary. One of them had just graduated 2 weeks before. From what I understand, they had a lot of difficulty. That would have been enough for most people and maybe even for me for most of my life. But it wasn't enough for me then. I wanted revenge for what they had done to me. So, I arranged a meeting with one of the project managers, PM, from the Department of the Military that we had done our tests for. I casually mentioned to him that I had left my old job. He was shocked. Remember how I said they never gave me credit for anything? Well, the military PMs considered me an invaluable expert and could not understand why the lab had driven me away. They immediately pulled several $1 million worth of work from the lab and gave it to the competition. Several labs were involved, because they had no confidence that the lab could do the work anymore. When I ran into one of the lab managers, the only half-decent guy there, I casually mentioned my meeting with the PM and I could tell he figured out how the military knew I had left. It took them years to recover, and honestly, I don't know if they ever really did. Last time I checked their webpage, it hadn't been updated in at least 12 years. I would have been happy with a $20,000 raise. Ecstatic even. But they weren't willing to spend $20,000 and lost $2 million to start and more in the long run. I started my own business and now make at least 5 times what I would if I had stayed there until now, and more than 10 times what I was making when I left.